All right, so are you ready to dive into something developers always seem to be talking about?
Always.
What have we got? This time, it's the big one. Monoliths versus microservices.
Ah, the classic debate, right.
It never gets old,
Hmm.
especially when you've got a bunch of developers with strong opinions all chiming in.
I bet we've got some passionate takes here. Where do they stand, by the way? Any clear favorites?
Well, the initial question was simple. What's your take on monoliths versus microservices? It's interesting how this one question kind of opens up this whole Pandora's box of issues in software development.
Yeah, it's like a window into how teams work together, how companies are structured, even their whole philosophy on building software.
Totally. It's
Yeah.
way more than just which architecture is, quote, better, right? It gets into the human side of coding, too.
Absolutely. Which is always the most interesting part, in my opinion. So what are we seeing in these responses? Give me the good stuff.
Okay, so right off the bat, someone brought up that classic saying, premature optimization is the root of all evil. It seems like a lot of developers are in the start simple camp.
Makes sense. Why overcomplicate things if you don't have to, right? A well-designed monolith can take you pretty far.
Right, and that's actually a point someone made really well. Even if you're starting with a monolith, make sure it's well designed. Think about modularity.
Like having a good set of tools, each with a clear purpose, not just a jumbled mess, right?
Exactly. That way, if you do need to break out a piece into its own service later, it's not. Well, one developer said it's like trying to unring a bell.
Ouch. Yeah, trying to detangle a monolith after the fact when it wasn't built that way. That's a special kind of pain.
It's like trying to unscramble an egg, right? Once it's mixed, it's mixed. But then things got even more interesting. We had someone arguing that the real issue isn't even monoliths versus microservices. It's about aligning your architecture with the business itself.
Interesting. I like where this is going. So what are they saying the way the business operates should dictate how the software is structured?
Yeah, they're advocating for service orientation that's driven by actual business functions, not just the tech team's personal preference.
Okay, so it's not just about what's technically elegant, but what actually reflects how the business works and what it's trying to achieve.
And this brought up another crucial point about scale that I think gets overlooked a lot. It's not just about how many requests your system can handle.
Right. It's so much more than that.
Yeah, it's about your team size, how your company is organized, how well you can adapt to changes. It's like scaling your processes alongside your tech.
Absolutely. Because if you're not careful, that technical scalability you gain with microservices can come with a whole new set of challenges. Communication overhead, deployment complexity, monitoring.
It's almost like imagine the difference between coordinating a team of 10 versus a team of 100.
Yeah.
That communication overhead alone is huge.
Huge and easy to underestimate. So it circles back to being careful about jumping into microservices too early, right?
Yeah, because if you don't know what you're doing, you might end up with what one developer called a distributed monolith, which to me sounds even scarier.
A distributed monolith. Yeah, it's basically like taking a messy room and instead of cleaning it, you just spread the clutter out over multiple rooms.
More rooms, same problem. So planning is key, even if you're not diving headfirst into microservices on day one.
Absolutely. And that's where I think this idea of service orientation comes in. Even within a monolith, you can still design your system in terms of well-defined services with clear boundaries.
So it's kind of like laying the groundwork for a future city, even if you're not building all the skyscrapers right away.
Perfect analogy. Having that good street plan from the get-go makes future development way smoother. And speaking of planning, one thing that seems crucial is identifying those potential fracture points in your system early on.
Yeah, where are the likely bottlenecks? And apparently the data layer is a big one.
Oh, for sure. Trying to untangle a monolithic database schema after the fact, that's like, imagine having to split a giant spreadsheet with thousands of rows and columns into smaller spreadsheets. But that spreadsheet is your company's most critical data.
Yeah, that's not keeping me up at night or anything.
You're telling me. Makes you sweat just thinking about it.
Right. Okay, so if untangling a database is our nightmare scenario, what's a good real-world example of, maybe a company that got microservices right, or at least learned some tough lessons along the way?
Well, it's interesting because even the big players, with all their resources, sometimes have to go through a bit of trial and error.
Oh, for sure. No one gets it perfect on the first try. Who are you thinking of?
Well, Uber, for example. They've been very public about moving away from a purely microservice-based approach.
Oh, wow, really? I hadn't heard that. What happened? Why did they backpedal?
It wasn't so much about completely abandoning microservices, but they realized they had gone a little overboard.
Okay, so they needed to, like, right-size the ship a bit.
Exactly. They ended up adopting something called domain services to regain some modularity.
Domain services, huh? I've heard the term, but to be honest, I'm a little fuzzy on what it actually means in practice.
Yeah, it can sound a bit abstract. Basically, it's about aligning your services with the core activities of the business, those core business capabilities.
So instead of the tech driving how things are structured, you let the business itself guide how the code is organized.
Precisely. And they're big proponents of something called domain-driven design, or DDD for short.
Okay, so for those of us just hearing about DDD for the first time, what is it in a nutshell?
Imagine you're building an online store, right? So instead of thinking about, okay, I need a database, I need a user interface, you start by identifying the core functions of the business.
Like customers need to be able to browse products, they need to be able to place orders, that kind of thing.
Yes. Things like product catalog management, order processing, customer relationship management, these become your core building blocks.
Got it. So you're saying each of these functions, these business capabilities, could potentially be its own service.
Exactly. And by doing so, you create a system that's much more modular and easier to maintain. Each service has a specific responsibility, making it easier to understand, modify, scale, all that good stuff.
So it's like dividing a company into specialized departments.
Yeah.
Marketing does its thing, accounting does its thing, but they all need to function within the larger company structure.
Exactly. And just like in a well-run company, communication and clear boundaries are key. Same goes for microservices, right?
Makes sense. But I can see where things could get messy. We had someone mention that a lot of developers misunderstand microservices. They think it's just about making things tiny, just breaking down a monolith into a bunch of tiny services without really understanding the bigger picture.
Oh, absolutely. That's a recipe for disaster. It's like trying to build a house by randomly gluing together Lego bricks without a plan. You might get something vaguely house-shaped, but it's going to be fragile, and good luck trying to remodel anything later on.
I love that analogy
Yeah.
because it highlights that it's not about the size of the services, but about how well they're designed and how well they align with the actual work being done, right?
100%. And this actually ties back to what we were talking about earlier with team dynamics and how companies are structured.
Oh, right, because the way teams are organized can really impact whether a monolith or microservices makes more sense.
Exactly. And we had some really interesting comments about that. One person was saying that in their experience, the more teams you have on a project and the less they agree on things. Well, let's just say microservices might be a good way to minimize the damage.
Oh, interesting. So if you've got a bunch of teams with different priorities, different ways of doing things, giving them more autonomy with microservices could actually reduce friction.
That's the idea, at least. But of course, it's not quite as simple as that. Several other developers were quick to point out that microservices don't magically eliminate communication problems.
Because now you've got these network boundaries between things that might have been simple function calls before.
Exactly. You need even clearer communication and more well-defined interfaces between those teams when you're working with microservices.
Right. So if you have teams that already can't agree on how things should work together, well,
Throwing microservices at the problem isn't going to magically fix it. It's like saying, we can't agree on how to decorate the living room, so let's just divide the house in half and each decorate our own side. You might end up with two nice-looking sides, but good luck moving between them.
that's a good way to put it. So team size, team dynamics, those are all huge factors to consider.
Huge. And sometimes a smaller team that's really in sync might actually be more efficient with a well-structured monolith, just because of the speed and ease of coordination.
It's like the difference between a small startup and a giant corporation,
Yeah.
right? The startup can move much faster with a flat structure and one central decision maker. The corporation needs those separate departments and clearly defined roles just to function.
Totally. It's like you wouldn't buy 1,000 industrial ovens if you were just starting your bakery and only selling a few loaves a day, right?
Definitely not. You'd be drowning in ovens. So starting small and scaling gradually is key. But what about those companies that, they're not tiny anymore, but they're not quite ready for a full-blown microservices architecture either? Is there a middle ground for them?
Right, because jumping straight to that level of complexity can be overwhelming. And that's where this idea of a highly available monolith comes in. It's a really pragmatic approach that I feel like doesn't get talked about enough.
It's not as trendy as microservices, but hey, sometimes the classics are classics for a reason, right? What makes a monolith highly available anyway?
It's all about building in those features for resilience and scalability right from the start. So things like load balancing, database replication, and most importantly, that clear modularity we were talking about earlier.
Ah, so you're kind of future-proofing it in a way. You might not need to break it apart right now, but if you do later, it'll be a smoother transition.
Exactly. It's like building a house with those expansion walls just in case you need a bigger kitchen someday. You're not ripping down walls later on.
Much less messy.
Yeah.
So this highly available monolith sounds like a great option for companies that are anticipating growth but aren't quite ready for the full microservices plunge, right?
Absolutely. It lets them focus on delivering value quickly early on while still keeping the door open for architectural changes down the line. Speaking of finding that balance between simplicity and flexibility, did you see that comment about monoliths with nanoservices? I thought that was interesting.
I did. It's a new one for me, to be honest. Is that like a hybrid approach?
Yeah, it's kind of trying to get the best of both worlds. So you're still fundamentally building a monolith, but you're organizing it into these very small, loosely coupled components, the nanoservices, that communicate internally rather than over a network.
Okay, so you get some of that isolation and flexibility of microservices without the overhead of a fully distributed system.
Exactly. It's like having separate rooms in your house, each with its own purpose, but they all share the same plumbing and electrical systems.
Makes sense. So it seems like a lot of these different approaches are really about finding the right level of granularity, the right level of coupling for your specific situation.
100%. And that's something that came up again and again in these developer opinions. It's not about blindly chasing the latest trends. It's about really understanding the trade-offs involved in each approach and then making a decision based on your project's needs, your team's strengths, all of that.
Right, because as much as we love to geek out about the technical details, at the end of the day, software development is about solving real problems for real people, right?
Absolutely. And sometimes the simplest solution really is the best one. We had a few developers who straight up called microservices overkill for many projects, and honestly, they have a point. If you're a small team with limited resources, the complexity of a microservices architecture might not be worth it.
It's about picking the right tool for the job, right? Just because you can use a chainsaw doesn't mean it's the best way to cut a piece of paper.
Exactly. And, it's not just about monoliths and microservices either. There's a whole world of other architectural patterns out there. Event-driven architectures, serverless architectures, each with its own strengths and weaknesses.
True. And it's easy to get caught up in the hype cycle and feel like you need to be using the latest and greatest. But really, the best architecture is the one that evolves with your project and your team, right?
Absolutely. It's about being adaptable and always learning, always refining your understanding of what works best in different situations.
It's a journey, not a destination, as they say. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, from the importance of modularity and planning to the potential pitfalls of premature optimization. We talked about domain-driven design, highly available monoliths, even those intriguing nanoservices.
We did. And if there's one big takeaway I hope our listeners walk away with, it's this. The decision of whether to go with a monolith or microservices or any other architecture for that matter, it's not about finding the one right answer that everyone agrees on.
Right. It's about understanding the trade-offs and making an informed decision based on your specific context.
Exactly. So ask yourself, what are the specific challenges your project is facing? What are your team's strengths and weaknesses? What makes the most sense for your particular situation? Maybe it is microservices, maybe it's a monolith, maybe it's some hybrid approach we haven't even talked about.
Or maybe, just maybe, it's time to invent a whole new architecture. But that's a discussion for another deep dive.
Definitely. Until next time.
Happy coding, everyone.